Say Trish.
Say, Karen.
We're here for another talk
An important one. Very
or read
important.
on my part.
Do you want to launch in or what do you want to do?
Um, you can go ahead.
Okay, all right. Sego, kentege kanyangahaga. Uh, and I'm hoping everybody has a good plan for National Indigenous Peoples Day. And in honor of that day, I was asked to give a talk and was floating around some ideas. And I thought to myself, well, the really big one is that you weren't supposed to be here. You weren't supposed to stay here. Everybody's plan was for you to move, leave, be levered out or asked to leave, compelled to leave, whatever, and you're still here. And so I thought the big theme of today,
So the theme of the day is resistance, I bet you were going to say.
yeah. Okay, so at the very beginning of the community, uh, even before you've actually, probably even before you actually arrived on the shores, in the time period 1783 and leading into 1784 and the time of the arrival, the British government was concerned about the splitting of the Six Nations people between two locations. They weren't happy about this. Sir Frederick Haldimand was the general and commander-in-chief, and he wasn't happy that Captain John and his people wanted to go to the Bay of Quinte, and Joseph Brant and his people wanted to go to Ohsweken. And so he kept trying to say how upset he was about the splitting up of the Mohawks and the splitting of the Six Nations people. Oh, don't you just want to all be together? And Captain John was adamant. He said no, they had chosen the Bay of Quinte and that's where they were going to go. But I have a little bit of a little new insert here. So it seems that there was always pressure to move or inducements to move. And one of the first ones occurred in October 1797. You haven't been here very long. And the Reverend John Stewart reported that, quote, several families of consequence removed to the Grand River, principally induced by the share they expect of the annual income arising from the sale of lands to the Mohawks. That cunning Brant proposes to divide the interest among his people, which will naturally operate to the advantage of his settlement and depopulate that of the Bay of Quinte.
Wow.
So there you even have, and I mean that's not even the government. That's Joseph Brant trying to lure people away.
Mm-hmm.
In 1816, William Claus, the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, instructed the man acting as resident agent in Kingston, his name was John Ferguson, to find out under what conditions MBQ would part with their land or any of it.
And MBQ replied, they're perfectly content with their land and not willing to part with it on any condition whatsoever or any part of it.
Yeah. In 1818, there is a document which sets out the plans of the government as to what Indian lands the Crown was targeting for purchase. And in that document, it states, bold as brass, they wanted the whole of the Mohawk Tract at the Bay of Quinte. That was their plan.
Yeah.
So in the fall of 1818, Ferguson wrote to MBQ with a message from William Claus, the Deputy Superintendent General, telling MBQ that the king wanted the Mohawk Tract and he wanted MBQ to move to Grand River.
But in February 1819, MBQ told Ferguson they would not move to Grand River. They say they will never agree to live together, is the quote.
In the fall of 1819, Ferguson was asked again by his superiors to find out if MBQ would leave the Mohawk Tract and go to Grand River.
And on the 2nd of December, 1819, MBQ told Ferguson that they now had little enough left for their posterity and they would never move to the Grand River. Hmm.
In 1835, a group of about 67 MBQ community members converted to Methodism. And when they did, they left the Bay of Quinte for Grand River. Now, this action brought back all the pressure for the rest to go. So there were white squatters who were living on the territory, and they were actively trying to persuade Mohawks to leave. And they were trying to persuade the government to let them, the squatters, stay on the Mohawk lands and dispossess the Mohawks. And we talked about this before, Karen, and you asked me the relationship about this to the group known as the Bay of Quinte Mohawks at Six Nations. And yes, this is the origin of that group. So up until about 1835, the listing for the groups at Six Nations doesn't contain these people until like 1836, 37. So they call them the Mohawks who have come from the Bay of Quinte and other things like that. And then a little bit later, they're known as the Bay of Quinte Mohawks. So that's why when people give me stuff to read and it uses them interchangeably, I have to say, no, wait. Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte are one group, Bay of Quinte Mohawks are another. But yeah, that's the origins right then. In May 1835, J.D. Clench, an officer of the Indian Department, was specifically asked to find out if MBQ were interested in moving.
But in June 1835, Clench had to repeat that the suggestion was coldly received, and MBQ were more determined to stay, strengthened by the increasing efforts of the intruders in persuading them to migrate. In September that year, MBQ told the lieutenant governor they wanted to stay, despite the offer to move to Grand River made by the lieutenant governor. And in December 1835, a delegation of chiefs from Grand River traveled up to the Bay of Quinte to invite MBQ to move to Grand River.
In October 1837, a government official, R.B. Sullivan of the Crown Lands Office, tried to raise the issue again, reporting, quote, many of the Indians are anxious to sell their land and then buy land at Grand River, and recommending an agent be sent to the Bay of Quinte to have their wishes and intentions officially known. But this sounds to me as if Mr. Sullivan was talking to the white squatters who were living on the territory. It was the white squatters who wanted the Mohawks to go.
The official response to MBQ in the fall of 1837 was that they wanted the squatters removed.
In 1845, an official from Indian Affairs again asked MBQ if they would consider moving to another settlement.
MBQ replied that the Grand River was the only place they could go to, but that there were serious problems with that most of the community had been born and brought up at the Bay of Quinte, and they deeply hoped they would not be compelled to leave.
In 1855, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Lord Bury, told MBQ that he wanted them to consider selling all their land not currently under cultivation. Bury said that there would come a time when all the land would be occupied by white people. So why not sell the land and have the money invested, and the MBQ children could receive the interest on the investment annually?
MBQ replied, "Why must our lands be occupied by white people? There is plenty for them elsewhere. And why are we being asked to do this when we are just all loyal as the white people? Because our skins are red? We trust not. Surely while we last we must live somewhere. Why not then allow us to remain on the land chosen by our chiefs as their portion after fighting for our king, and where the bones of our brave forefathers lay?" That's pretty touching.
It is, and so I know it resonates right now. It really resonates. Why are you being asked to do this? You don't need to keep on asking to do this, but you do. So anyway, so that if that doesn't say resistance, I don't know what, because it just keeps saying no.
I
Yeah.
had a I had a kind of a general understanding that we had been, asked to leave, but I didn't realize there was such a concerted effort and sustained over so many years, or that it started practically when we got here.
Yes. Yeah, I think the plan was that you were supposed to be maneuvered to be with the rest of
Eventually,
Six
all,
Nations. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, that's pretty obvious. But we
yeah,
kept saying no.
yeah. And so you are still here, and yes, you lost land, and we work on that, but you are still here.
Hmm.
So the second topic on resistance, um, that we thought we want to explore is religion, because there's an impression out there that um, that Tyendinaga was mainly Anglican and very devout, and um, and when you get that kind of monolithic belief, you really have to look into it to see if it's true. And basically, when you look into the details, you might find that it's really not that true. Um, uh, in in 1788, um, Reverend John Anderson came and did the sacrament, and he did it for 6 individuals. Now, the community was very small at that time, but communion for 6 individuals is not an overwhelming majority population in 1788. Um, and just going through time, just so we can explore this a little bit further. So in the minutes of 1800, Captain John reported that once Captain Isaac Hill came to the Bay of Quinte and formed his own party,
The door of the church has been locked, for how could we assemble there with such a burden on our minds?
which is interesting because you would think from a religious point of view, if you have trouble on your mind, the church is where you would go.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously, a church is somewhere to have good minds, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so the doors of the church could be locked,
Hmm.
and by the community. So
Yeah. Hmm.
anyway, so what kind of a community was it? How devout? How pious? Or what kind of spectrum are we working with? Are we working with everything from very pious to troublemakers? Probably, because that's in any community. Anyway, so it's kind of nice to get an outsider's point of view. So the next excerpt is from Peter Jones's diary, and he was Anishinaabe, and he became a Methodist um, reverend, or I don't know what they call them,
I think it's
lay preacher perhaps, or yeah. Anyway, this is an extract from his diary when he visited the Bay of Quinte in February 1826.
After an hour's rest, we pursued our journey to the Mohawk settlement. We called at the first Indian house we came to. I inquired if they would be willing to hear me preach that evening. They said they would, but they had no stable or hay for my horse, so that with reluctance we were obliged to go elsewhere for lodgings. After traveling a mile or two further, we came to a hut, where the man of the house received us kindly. He was a Mohawk, by the name of Crawford. I talked with him about religion, and informed him of the great reformation that had taken place amongst his nation at the Grand River. He appeared very serious and thoughtful. The Lord blessed me while praying with his family. There is an English church at this place where the Indians assemble on the Lord's Day, and are occasionally visited by the Reverend Mr. Molay, in whose absence one of the Indians reads the church service in his own language. They appear ignorant of experimental religion, for they still drink and dance. Oh, that they may leave off their wicked practices, and learn to walk in the way that leads to peace and holiness.
Yeah. And so also in February 1826, Peter Jones had this to say.
These Indians have adopted the manners and customs of the white people more than those on the Grand River, and have not been at all backward in learning their vices, for they drink, dance, and fiddle well, and where these leading evils are practiced, they often lead to misery and ruin.
So it's not all praying on a Sunday. Um, it led me to think about the conventions of religion and how people may have followed those conventions or may have resisted those conventions. The daughters of both Captain John Deseranto and Captain Isaac Hill did not follow the conventions of church rules regarding marriage and family. Margaret John had children with two different men before her marriage and children with a third man. And Catherine Hill was married to one man and then left him and went to live with another man and had children with him. So again, we're talking about we're going to live lives the way we want to. In 1832, in a letter from the missionary Saltern Givens to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, dated the 23rd of January, 1832.
The attendance at the church has been and still continues to be regular, and I am led to hope that there are not a few of them truly pious. From the period of my taking charge to the expiration of this last year, I have officiated at 41 baptisms, 5 marriages, and 7 burials. Number of communicants, 49.
Right. So in 1832, the total population of MBQ was 370. Well, again, if you say half of them were children, you're still not dealing with a lot of communicants.
No.
Yeah. Of course, in 1832, you only have the old church. You don't have, Christchurch hasn't been built yet, and All Saints doesn't exist. So you have the churches in the eastern part of it may have had to have done with travel, because travel was extremely difficult then. But still, it's not a lot of communicants. In 1842, the missionary Saltern Givens reported on a total of 45 communicants, but that was both Mohawks and whites. So that's not even all Mohawks. And in 1842, the total population of MBQ was 354, 4 chiefs, 90 warriors, 80 women, and the rest were children. So again, we're not dealing with overwhelming use of the church or the missionary.
Yeah.
Givens, missionary Givens, was asked in 1847 to write a report. He had then been the missionary for 11 years. And this was sort of like a status report on the community. How advanced is the community? How is the education, health, sort of everything else? So there was a series of questions. But one of the questions was, what has been their improvement during that time in the moral and religious character and in habits of industry?
The improvement of the tribes I allude to has been great, for within my recollection they have been reclaimed from the state of degraded vagrancy, settled in villages, and made partakers to a considerable extent of the blessings of Christianity. They have also improved in habits of industry. The Mohawks under my charge were converted before I came among them, but since my acquaintance with them, I think there has been a gradual improvement in morals, piety, and industry.
And I'd say that's kind of lukewarm.
Well, there's much evidence in it.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird that they even talk about what is it? The state of degraded vagrancy, settled in villages. I know, because you were settled in villages in Mohawk Valley.
Yeah, really.
So you got to kind of worry about an answer like that. Anyway, the community was complicated. You had the church institution. You had a lot of taverns. You had legal ones and illegal ones. There were issues with alcohol. And we know there was one brothel, that one that we know of. There might have been more. I don't know. And it was on the same road as Christchurch. So it's a complicated story. My own feeling is it could be that people went for events. They went for baptismals, marriages, and burials, and they were the cornerstone. There would have been people who were there every week, and there would have been people who weren't ever there, right?
Yeah.
You had everything.
You
So,
can't use the blanket statement like everybody was Anglican.
right. Nominally, I think if you ask the missionary, that's what they would say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, anyway, so in the 1880s, the Reverend was a man called, he was the Reverend Rural Dean Baker, and he became extremely unpopular. And they wanted him gone. They wanted him out. The community wanted him to leave. They petitioned the bishop. Get this guy out of here. The chief at that time, Chief Samson Green, said that the congregation had gone to pieces. Oh, this is your quote. I'm so sorry.
Some said Baker talked too much and was too much of a gossip. The community asked him to leave and he demanded additional money in settlement. Members of the community closed Christ Church thinking Baker had gone. When the church was reopened, it was reported in the Deseret Tribune that only a half a dozen Mohawks were seen in the congregation and not many more to be seen there Sunday after Sunday.
Right. So, something's going on there. This wasn't the only minister who had problems with the congregation. And they did have a tendency, if they did have a problem with the minister, they just didn't go. In the 1880s, a group of community members decided to leave the Anglican Church altogether, and they petitioned the minister of the Indian Department to have their wishes recognized. So this is another group. So it's not monolithic. You have people who are saying, we don't want to be part of this anymore. And it was hard to get away.
Your petitioners would humbly represent that they have severed their connection from the Church of England and united themselves with the Brethren. And they are desirous that the department will hereafter recognize them as brethren and not members of the Church of England. Charles, is that Charles Miracle and wife? Mrs. Eliza D. Powless, Abram S. Brandt and wife, Isaac Powless, Lydia Powless, Miss Margaret Powless, Mr. J. Cyril, Mrs. Cyril, A. Cyril, and E. Cyril. Those are the people that signed the petition?
They are. And they did leave. But imagine having to petition to somebody in government to say...
Yeah. So united themselves with the Brethren, is that referring to the... what is it referring to?
Well, the Brethren was akin to a Methodism.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The Powlesses, Isaac Powless in particular, is connected to the beginning of the Pentecostal church.
Okay.
On the territory. So, and for a while, of course, there was a Presbyterian church on the territory. Mm-hmm. After a long period of time of petitions in order to diversify the religious beliefs, which some didn't want to do. So like I said, you're dealing with, there was people who wanted something else, and there was people who, no, we are Anglican, and that's who we are. We don't want another church. Mm-hmm. But once the Presbyterian church burnt down, it was never built again. So that's the cemetery on the York Road, is the cemetery Presbyterian church. Mm-hmm. It might be more accurate to say across the community that there were various levels of commitment to the Anglican Church. Some were very devout and others not so much. Whatever the beliefs of the community members, we know that underneath that, there was something older that still existed. We know that there was jugglery going on. There was a belief in witchcraft, a belief in somebody sickening somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
We know that traditional medicines continued through this time.
Mm-hmm.
And we discussed this, that you might be a churchgoer and still seek out help of a different kind, right?
Right.
And I wonder about within the community, even if there is, if you feel as if somebody is wishing you ill will, would people go to the church to talk about it, or would they do something else? It's older. You brought it with you. It hasn't gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sort of resistance. I think all the ministers would complain about how many people actually went to church, given the population, how many people actually went to church. But you were doing it on your own terms, you
Mm-hmm.
know, be you a
Yeah.
churchgoer or not.
Yeah.
Um, so the last topic, just to get into a little bit, and this is going to pull some threads from some of our previous talks, is politics, the political system within the community. The Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte organized their own political system from the time they arrived, 1784. And they had their own idea of council, what council was, who was on council, all of that. Now, it changed over time. You went from the early days where it was the old chiefs on a traditional based system. We know there's, old John Green was a Wolf Clan chief in the community. We know that Joseph Smart was a Bear Clan chief in the community. So we know that it is a traditional thing. But over the years, you have changes get proposed, right? And so you end up with this kind of weird hybrid council where you're dealing with the old chiefs, but you also have people who are either elected or selected to be councillors. But you're doing it on your own terms. For the most part. As we creep into the later part of the 19th century, you end up with more and more and more interference from government. But it's only going to get worse, right? So the big thing that happened was in 1869, where you have federally mandated elected councils, and the beginning of what will be the end of the life chiefs. Life chiefs, you can have them, but you can't replace them.
Mm.
So the first election of a council, full elected council under federal rules, took place in December 1870. 62 men voted. Only men could vote, right? That's what the law said. But there were approximately 148 men eligible to vote. So less than half did. Again, not an overwhelming sort of support for this new system.
Yeah. And in October 1870, even before that first election, there was an attempt to install a traditional council with the help of men from 6 nations. In 1888, there was a petition sent by MBQ supporters of traditional council to the Governor-General of Canada with the names of men and women. In 1889, there was another attempt to install traditional council. In 1915, the men elected to council were all Thunderwater supporters. They supported a traditional council. They let women into the council house. They would not sign their oaths of office. They wanted to keep the minute books themselves, and they did not want to be subordinate to the Indian agent. In September 1916, there was another attempt to install traditional council. In December 1918, the Thunderwater Council tried to eliminate elections and return to a traditional council. But the Indian agent allowed only the men nominated for elections to be declared as an elected council. In February 1919, there was another petition with the names of many men and women who protested against the actions of the Indian agent. The quote, "The Indians have decided not to allow the Indian agent, Mr. G. M. Campbell's appointed councillors to control or rule the people of this Tyendinaga. In April 1919, there was another attempt to install a traditional council. In the 1920s and 1930s, Thunderwater supporters were elected to council to the great agitation of the Indian Agent. In 1927, the Indian Act said there was to be one chief and the rest were to be councillors. But here, all the councillors were called chief in defiance of the rules until about 1941. Wow, so again and again they kept trying.
Yes.
To no avail, fortunately, but...
Well, yes. It's because I think because it becomes so unbalanced about who wields power as the government grows in the power and influence. Even if you've got the whole community behind you, they still just say no.
Yeah. Because they can.
Yeah. But it doesn't stop people. It didn't stop them.
No. Good for them.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So there were other areas. I'm sure that people can think in their own lifetimes or in their lifetimes of their parents, grandparents, that there are other items that we could have explored this time around. And you're not always going to be successful, especially when you've kind of got somebody who is looking to manage you as Indian Affairs look to manage this problem that they saw. But you had, we talked about this, Karen, you had areas of jurisdiction at one time, and then you were forced to give it up. There was a time when the day schools were under the jurisdiction of the council, and councillors were the trustees. And then the government forced you to give that up in the 1920s when they took over education. And so you've had to deal with this all the time. We talked about policing. At one time, way back when, there was a member of MBQ who was the constable, local constable. But that didn't stay. You know, you had other rules come in. Resistance towards the Indian agent. I think in a lot of families, people will talk about that. I have talked to some people, and they just, if they didn't have to go to the Indian agent, they would not go. They didn't want to give him the power. We talked about the resistance towards a contracted doctor, and this was a new one. I had not heard this, so maybe you could talk about that a second.
Yeah, well, I just remember my family talking about that. The doctor was in Deserano, so that was a ways from where we lived, on the other end. But yeah, they just had no interest in going to the doctor. Not that, like when I was a child, I don't recall. The only time I went to the doctor was when I had my tonsils out when I was about 9 or 10, or when I had a sprained ankle really bad one time, and I went then. I was older, 12 or older. But and I was sick a lot with bronchitis and pneumonia, whatever, but it was mustard plasters, and it was brown paper and menthol, and it was home remedies like that. Going to the doctor, no, we didn't do that. And especially not that doctor. They didn't want to go to that doctor. Yeah.
Now, was that just because he was that far away, or was it because he was the one who was being paid and you didn't get a choice?
Yeah, no choice was the...
Yeah, I can see that. It makes some sense. Another thing was after the Indian Act of 1951, and there were movements afoot for regaining some control over your own lives. And one of the things that happened was that in 1959, MBQ was able to regain control of their own money. That is, to have control over their own funds. So that would have been a wonderful thing. And what I love even better is that the person that they put in charge of that was Phyllis Green. So not only did you get control of your own bank account, writing your own checks, whatever, it's a woman.
That must have been an experiment on the part of government. Would you say it was, or
There were two communities.
didn't advocate for it enough, or?
Was MBQ and Walpole Island were the two. And it was very flashy. It's in the magazines put out by Indian Affairs. New rights for Mohawks.
You can do this too.
Yes. And it was sort of like tied to the whole being progressive and but underlying that, it was like being able to do something with your own money. It's and I don't know if the government saw it as putting you on a course towards financial training, knowledge, independence. I'm not sure about that. I haven't read anything about that, but it certainly is interesting. And I'm sure, as I say, that there's others out there in the community that you could think of other ways there has been resistance. If you think about the Indian Act, the legislation was enacted to manage and fix a problem, a perceived problem, the Indian problem. And hopefully the goal was to manage Indians out of existence. There was significant resistance to that as well. Now here we are today, and you are still here, and there is still an Indian Act, but you are still here. So I think one of the things is you can, if you can hear it, you can feel it, and especially right now, I think you can hear it and feel it pretty well.
I think so. Yeah. I believe you're right.
I hope so. I hope so, because I guess one thing is within the community and all the different parts of the community, there has always been a strong push to do it your own way. Whatever it is.
Whatever it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to say determined rather than stubborn.
Determined, it's good, yes. Oh, thank goodness. Just imagine if things had gone a different way. We wouldn't be having this conversation today if the government got its way in 1818, or at some point you were compelled to leave. And who's to know? Who's to say? It was standing up and saying no. Standing up and saying they can go and live somewhere else. We live here.
Yeah, get them off our land.
Yeah, our forefathers are here. This is the land. We got the Simcoe deed. This is ours.
Well, that was probably the biggest protection, right? Because we had that.
Oh, if you didn't have that,
we would have just been pushed along to Niagara.
But Captain John had to keep asking too. He didn't give up. He kept on asking. I want the piece of paper. I can see what's happening. There's people to the left, people to the right, people to the north. We need our protection. So he's there. He had to do it.
He's determined for us.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think he, thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
I'm very
goodness.
grateful.
Yeah. So anyway, so there is my best wishes for this weekend. Um, I don't know
Okay.
what the community is doing, but I hope everything goes well.
There's quite a few things. There's a fun run, and there were activity kits to give out with different things in it. There's going to be talent streamed on that day. There's a parade, a car
Yay.
parade. So I hope it will be fun. And
Oh, well,
thanks so much for doing this, Nella.
well, as you're doing whatever you're doing that day, have a little think back to your ancestors.
I will for sure.
Yeah. They thank goodness they just said no.
They just hung in.
Strongly but politely.
Yeah, good.
I wish they had said stop asking.
Just quit with the letters.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Trish.
All right. Please take care. Everybody, be well.